dilemmas, maybe infertility. Maybe they want to talk to you about something like stem cell research. They've got a child that needs a stem cell transplant. How are you going to respond in a situation like that? What is the easiest way to make this entire discussion? I mean, because we could do what the world likes to do and try to have situational ethics. And we take it by case basis. But as a Christian, what is a better method for determining right and wrong when it comes to ethical dilemmas?
The Bible.
Okay, the Bible, definitely. And using the Bible, what do we need to discern? What is the one key fundamental plank that you've got to be able to communicate and teach somebody in order for everything else ethically to make sense? How about when life begins? Does that make sense? When does God view life to begin? We're going to touch on that some today when we start getting into the laws. But think with me for just a moment. If you are able to take 4, 6, 8 verses and share with somebody who is sitting in your office, and they say, hey, you know what? We'd really like to talk to you about our infertility, or we'd really like to talk to you about cloning or stem cell research. It's going to help for you to be able to look at them and say, I look forward to sitting and talking to you about this. Before we get started, let's make sure we both understand what is God's standard for when life begins. And once you have laid that out, it's then going to make all of the ethical dilemmas a whole lot easier, because you can look at them and simply say, okay, this new procedure that you're talking about with me, does it involve the destruction of life as God sees it? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
All right. Any questions, comments, thoughts before we jump into the text today? I know there may be a little bit of anxiety about what's coming up, but hopefully not too bad.
Were you able
Chris?
to, I was going to look real quick. Did you get the PowerPoint from last class up? Okay.
It is up there.
Did you get my email?
It should be labeled Bear Valley Class 4.
It is.
So if you look on the FTP site, it is there. Other comments, questions? As I mentioned to you guys last week, the test is going to be a little bit of a variety. There'll be some true, false, multiple choice, short answer, that kind of thing. 1 or 2 will be a longer answer. Guys, when you start looking over my test, I don't want you to have a stroke. There are going to be a few questions on there that are not solely based on the Pentateuch. And by that I mean this. You may see a couple of application questions. If you are a preacher and this happens, what do you do? And basically there, I'm looking for you to be able to give a logical defense. Obviously, I would love for you to have Scripture. I know that we're covering a lot, and you may not be able to quote book, chapter, and verse, but at least try to communicate, in the book of Genesis it says this, or in the book of Exodus it says this, therefore I would do X, Y, Z. So there will be a couple of problems like that I kind of want you to work through that are going to be more of a logical, help me to make sure that you're understanding what we're covering kind of deal. Thoughts, questions, comments before we move on? All right, good deal. We left off in Exodus chapter 12, and as you guys recall, we were being delivered, so to speak. We had just finished up talking about the fact that they were using a hyssop plant. They were using that particular plant to put blood around their doorpost, and the Passover was being initiated. If you look in Exodus 12, chapter 1, actually chapter 12, verse 2, what we see happening is God telling them from this point on, you're going to start looking at your calendar year differently. That your deliverance, this freedom, is going to mark the first month of the year to you. So if you look very carefully, verse 2, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Why do you think he did that? As a memorial. Guys, one of the things that you're going to see repeated over and over and over in today's class is God is trying to put in front of them memorials. He is trying to say, look, do not forget what you've been through. Do not forget who I am. Time and time, he uses both visual things. He uses holidays. He is trying to get this people to be able to pass on his might, his majesty, his deliverance. And yet, time and time again, as we're going to see, basically they either forget, they whine, they complain, and ultimately they don't continue to pass it on to future generations. Look down at verse 11 with me. He's telling them precisely how he wants them to kill the meat, prepare the meat. Notice what it says in verse 11. Thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. What is the significance of the belt, the sandals, and the staff? What's that all about?
Ready to travel.
Ready to go. You're going to eat this meal in a condition that is ready to go, ready to literally walk out the door. You skip on down to verse 14. So this day shall be to you a memorial. You shall keep it as a feast of the Lord throughout your generations. And again, if those of you who write in your Bible or highlight in your Bible, if you look at that throughout your generations, you're going to see that phrase coming up over and over and over and over again in the text. It's something that I think we in the church do a miserable job of. I think it warrants just a second or two of discussion in that we don't really teach multi-generational faithfulness in the church that much anymore. Now, we do teach lessons on, hey, you need to get your children to heaven. But ultimately, what he's talking about here is multi-generational faithfulness. How do you go about doing that? I'm going to start calling on you. Do what?
Establish some type of custom or tradition in your own family that represents what God has done in your life.
Okay. So if we establish give me an example.
We were talking about this one other time. One day, me and my family was reading about in Joshua about the stones, and we were going to put a pile of stones on our property.
Yeah.
To remember, it's one of the places where our lives had changed. It's when I came to believe in the Lord, and our entire family changed.
Okay. What is the typical passage that preachers go to about parents teaching their children?
And your children
Yep.
go.
Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 6.
Deuteronomy 6 verses 4 through 9, the Shema. Let me encourage you guys, put a placeholder in your Bibles at Exodus, and let's flip over to Deuteronomy 4. To me, Deuteronomy 4 packs an even bigger punch. I love Deuteronomy 6, obviously. I preached on it, taught on it a lot. But look at Deuteronomy 4, verse 9. Take heed to yourself, diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Teach them to your children and your grandchildren, or your version may say, to your sons' sons. How many times have you guys heard a preacher admonishing the elderly people that they have an obligation to their grandchildren? You don't hear that very often. And yet that's precisely what is going on in this passage right here, folks. He is saying you've got an obligation. Teach it to your son's sons, or teach it to your children and your grandchildren. That's how we start to get multi-generational faithfulness. I'm just calling names because I got my list in front of me. So let's see. How about David?
Yes, sir.
How would you teach, if you had a congregation of 100 people, how would you teach multi-generational faithfulness?
Well, obviously going to these verses and showing them the importance of some of the statistics of how many people drop away from the Lord's faith when they hit college, and not just that they do, but why they do. Showing them that it's because we don't give them a good enough grounding in the Word of God, and we don't give them enough reason to want to come back to the Word of God to solve their issues.
Okay, that's a great answer. But from a personal perspective and from just a straightforward point of view, it's not going to be good enough. And I'll tell you why I say that. How many times in the last 10 or 15 years have we spouted the statistics, we beat our head against the pulpit, trying to get people to realize you are losing your children, and yet how many times is that message not really taken to heart until the kids are gone? What's another way we can do it?
According to me,
Yeah.
we can do it in our family. An example.
Say that again.
We can show the congregation this by doing it in our family. Be an example.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You've got to do that. You have got to do that. That is first and foremost. Do not get up and preach about in-home Bible study if you don't do it.
Amen.
Do not get up and preach about having, special time for family or prayer or whatever. If you're not really doing it at home, then please do not get up and talk about it in the pulpit. Jared?
Establish a culture or a tradition in your family where you get together and you study every night, or at least every second night. That's why I'm still a Christian today, and a lot of my friends aren't. Is that my dad was very stubborn, and he wouldn't let me do my homework for half an hour every night, which was cool because now I'm still here. The topics covered are very important as well. It's important to go through denominational doctrines. There are technical things that you can take your kids through when you've got them there every night that you can't always get through in church. And one of those things would definitely be boosting them up about creation versus evolution, the differences between the two. That was very important for me.
Absolutely. I like the fact that you pointed out, hey, I might not even be here if my dad hadn't have done this. I think one of the areas that we have failed in the church in the past is allowing the members of the church to believe that they can basically tiptoe or wade themselves into the world and embrace worldly things. And because of that, they have lost sight of the priority of God and the fact that He should have priority over our lives. You look at how many congregations are filled with people who, yes, they'll come Sunday morning, but if there's the World Series baseball game on, or if the Super Bowl is on, or if their kid's soccer game is on a Wednesday night, or if they've got this play, or if they're just tired, or if the weather's bad outside, or you name the excuse, they're going to let something come in between them and their devotion to God, because ultimately that has not been their priority from a very young age. Yes, sir.
The point you made about the weather, my family, we've always been very big on, even if you can't get out and go to a church, if it's a Sunday, you just do it at home. And you can get in trouble when it comes to some narrow-minded people who say you didn't come to church because of it. If you have more than enough at home, I mean, I grew up in a house where it was at least at all times 9 people, and more than half of them were baptized. So, I mean, you got mainly what the church is at home. Just go ahead and do it. If you don't bring that in, you leave time to say, okay, well, my cousins are in town. We don't have to go to church. We'll just stay at home and do whatever. Or, I mean, things that the devil present in front of families that slowly get them away from God's word.
Right. Very good. Keely.
I went to a camp one year, and there was a woman talking to all the teenage girls, and she emphasized something that I hadn't thought enough about. She said, I am going to do everything in my power to make sure my kids get to heaven. Everything else comes secondary to that except my husband. And, as a 15-year-old girl, I wasn't even thinking about kids yet, but it was like, whoa, I better start thinking about this stuff now, about how I'm going to plan to do that. And so kind of, not just attacking the parents, or promoting it to the parents, but to the children as well. Start thinking about what you're going to tell your own kids, and get that linear way of thinking planted early.
Exactly. Very good comments, all of you. One of the things that Melinda and I do on a regular basis in front of our children is we will pray for their mates, our children's mates. My kids are all under the age of 10, but on a very regular basis they hear us praying for that they will marry Christian mates and that they will serve faithfully and strongly in the church, and that they will rear their children in a faithful way, because we want, even at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, we want to impress upon them so much that this is a priority, that, hey, we are even worried right now at your very young age about who you're going to marry and how you will raise your children, so that our kids are already starting to kind of think about that. I liked what you said about, hey, you can worship at home, you've got a big family. My children know that no matter what, we are going to worship God on Sunday, and we're going to study the Bible on Wednesday. Now, they don't always know where, and there's kind of a running joke at our house about, are we going to actually be at our home congregation, or where are we going to be this Sunday? But they know, even if we're on vacation, as we were a week or so ago, they know we're going to be somewhere Sunday morning. Every time that the doors are open up to allow us to be there, we're going to be there. Lots of times we have done things, we have a nightly Bible time, and there have been a lot of nights where we're doing Bible time at 9:30, 8 o'clock at night in a car, 70 miles down the road, trying to get home. But our kids know that before we go to bed, we're going to do that. And so here we are. We got the family wagon patted down. They're singing. We're talking about the Bible, but they know that's a priority to us, and so we don't want to let a day slip by without it. So that's one of the things that I would point out in this particular, what's going on in this particular thing, is he is trying to communicate multi-generational faithfulness. We look then at Exodus chapter 13. And look with me, obviously, again, verse 8. You shall tell your son in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up out of Egypt. So again, that idea. We have the law of the firstborn being given. God doesn't want our leftovers. And again, as preachers, we need to understand that, and we need to communicate that. Somebody tell me who is the worst, as far as worst educated when it comes to giving in the church? What age group?
Giving, you mean like contributing as part of worship?
Yep.
Teenagers, wouldn't it be?
13 to 25-year-olds. And yet, here's an interesting point to that, and keep this in mind. Do you know who now has more expendable money, that is, monies that is not really attributed towards bills? Who has more money than any other generation? And that would be that same age range. Because think about it for just a moment. Who's got $20 to spend on a CD? Who's got $13 to go to a movie? Folks, they got a home they're living in that's paid for. Their bills are paid for. Most of them, depending on what age range they are, most of them have got some kind of a source of income, whether it be a job, part-time job, full-time job, whether it be mom and dad helping them. And yet we've done such a miserable job of teaching on giving, especially giving of your first fruits, that basically they go from being a 6-year-old where they throw a few coins into the plate to thinking, well, you know what, I'm a teenager, so it's not really expected of me. How much money do you think teens spend on an average Friday or Saturday night date?
From experience, close to $100.
There you go. And then what happens on that Sunday morning when that plate's passed by?
3
cents.
Right. Basically, you open your wallet, you see if you got a few ones, and you toss them in there. So, again, we've got to understand all the way back, as God is starting to prepare us for the Mosaic age, He's saying, I want your best. I want the unspotted. I want the firstlings. Starting in chapter 14, we've got probably one of the best remembered biblical accounts, especially given people like Charleston Heston, crossing of the Red Sea. Some of you have probably heard of a gentleman by the name of Ron Wyatt, who allegedly has discovered where the Red Sea was crossed. If you Google his name, you'll find all kinds of things. I do want to kind of real quickly put to bed one thing about him. In some of the congregations you go to, there will be people who are very familiar with his archaeological work. Be very cautious as to giving this guy his due, because allegedly this is the same man who's found the Ark of the Covenant, Noah's Ark, chariot wheels in the Red Sea, and I forget he's got like 4 alleged major discoveries. Now, folks, if anybody has found the Ark of the Covenant and the Ark, Noah's Ark, do you not think that would probably be pretty big news? And unfortunately, what happens a lot of times with people like this is they bring more shame onto the church than they do good news. So be very careful when somebody says, hey, haven't they found the Ark? I always try to temper that very cautiously. Look with me at verse 7 of chapter 14. Talking here about Pharaoh, he's coming after the people. It says he took 600 choice chariots, and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every single one of them. Pharaoh was chapped. Why was he mad?
His son.
What?
His son had died as a result.
Yeah. All the firstborn had just gotten killed, including his son. Now, if you are the highest man in the region, basically you can kind of think of it like the World Trade Center's falling, except on a more personal level. You think the leader of that country is going to get hot? Imagine if George Bush's children had been in those World Trade Centers. Think he'd been mad? Absolutely. So the Pharaoh says, that's it, I'm unleashing on you. Right. Notice verse 10. Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, behold, the Egyptians marched after them, so they were very afraid. The children of Israel cried out to the Lord. I suspect you could probably have seen the dust cloud for miles. You got 600 chariots. You've got untold thousands of soldiers that are marching towards this group of Israelites. They're coming after them. They look, they see the dust cloud, they know what it is. Look in Moses' response in verse 13. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which we will accomplish for you to this day. For the Egyptians, whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. How many of you in the class have heard that this was not really the crossing of the Red Sea, that maybe this was a seasonal drought? Any of you? Okay, what do you tell somebody that basically says, well, they just kind of went over a shallow part, or that this particular year they didn't get as much rain? What do you tell a skeptic? behind the pole.
Yeah, I'm stuck behind the pole.
Who is that? I can't.
I'll move over. The chariots were engulfed after they had crossed through.
Okay? Chariots were engulfed, even though if I'm a skeptic and I'm coming back on you, I would say, well, man, we have flash flooding today. What's the big deal? We got cars that are swallowed up here in the South. They don't listen to the little doo-doo-doo-doo-doo sound on the TV. What else?
Explain the pillar of fire. Skeptic.
Very nice. Okay. Of course, you know, I might look at that and say, well, you know, that's a comet.
What's the likelihood of all these happening all at the same time?
You guys have missed one major verse. Remember, we talked about allowing the text to defend itself. Yes, sir, in the back blue shirt, can't see who your face is.
See, I was just going to say, doesn't it say that the land they walked on was completely dry? I mean, if it's anywhere near the water, I've been at the ocean, and it's going to be kind of soggy and wet and squishy, even if it is a drought season.
Okay, that is a valid point. Now add to that what's going on in verse 22.
Brad, is it that the text actually says they went through the
That's
ocean?
where I'm at. Look at verse 22, Jared. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground. Notice the next part. The waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Let the text defend itself. Can anybody in their right mind argue that a wall on your right and your left is a seasonal drought? That's a wall of water on both sides of you. I don't think so. You add to that what the fellow in the back said about they walked on dry ground. If you got a wall of water over here, a wall of water over here, you're walking through on dry land. To me, that's pretty crystal clear that this was a miraculous event right through the Red Sea. So let's get back real quick to your point that you made over here about the pillar of fire and the cloud. What is the significance of that as far as how it's going to continue throughout their pilgrimage?
Pillar of fire is going to stay before them.
Okay, what time of day?
Well, during the night.
Okay. What about during the day?
What is it?
Smoke. A cloud
Notice
of smoke.
verse. Everybody look in your Bibles back at verse 19. Angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud went from before them, stood behind them. So it became the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all the night. What is the significance of this? I mean, you guys, surely you've read enough in the Old Testament to remember this pillar and this cloud are going to be part of what they follow during their wandering years, right? Yes. Okay. So if somebody tells you that this was a local event, that they just walked through the edge of the Red Sea, that it wasn't really a major event, make sure you are able to back it up and teach the fact that this is a miracle. Why is the fact that it is a miracle important anyway?
Well, it's good for refuting naturalism because there's a supernatural explanation for it.
Great for refuting naturalism. What is this going to do into the hearts and the minds of those Israelites?
The power of God.
Show them the power of God. Guys, realize that they are being delivered, and if the God who brought them out of Egypt cannot fix this, then they got big problems. And he's not all powerful. But by doing this, by showing his power and holding these walls of water on the left and right, he is revealing to them how powerful he is. Now, how big do you think this wall of water or this space was? many people, how many Israelites do we have at this point? Roughly 2. Just in your mind, be thinking 2 million people. I suspect everybody there has been to a major league ball game, whether it's football, baseball, whatever. You know how busy, I see y'all look at each other, probably went to a game this week, didn't you? Uh-huh. You know how busy it is. You know, as far as like how thick wall-to-wall people are. The concourses are just full. Now, realize most stadiums don't hold more than about 100,000 people. Multiply that by a factor of 20. And imagine trying to get all of those people across this sea. Guys, that's how big of a miracle this thing really is. That's when you start realizing, wow, God really is a powerful God. They get on the other side. Chapter 15, they start singing a song to Moses. And if you look very carefully at the song, for instance, verse 4, Pharaoh's chariots, his armies, he has cast into the sea, he has chosen captains. Also, his chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank to the bottom like a stone. You know, that again, there again, more proof that this was a miraculous event, that they were coming through a deep section of the sea, and that God was able to do what he needed to do. Comments, thoughts, questions up to about verse 22.
I got a question.
Yeah.
On the death of the firstborn, would that have been
Yes.
all firstborns or only firstborns that were still children? Because you might, I don't know, usually the Pharaoh would probably be the firstborn, but not always. So
Okay.
if it's all the firstborns and Pharaoh was the firstborn, who would have died?
Go back to chapter 11. It says, verse 5, all of the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. So apparently what he did was he basically kind of set Pharaoh's generation as the cutoff point, saying, okay, everybody below this section that's got firstborn, you're going to lose them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because you're right. I mean, obviously, if you're taking firstborn, you would be also talking about some of the parents. But I think the critical juncture here is the fact that they were parents. They had given birth. And so at that point, that removes them from being firstborn. Because at that stage, they have a firstborn. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Picking back up in chapter 15, verse 22. Two things I want us to notice before we get out of this particular chapter. Look at verse 24. Now, we just sang a song. You can just imagine the people, they're there, they're basically dancing. In fact, if you look at Miriam's song, and starting in verse 20, Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took the timbrel in her hand. All the women went out after her timbrels and with dances. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and the rider is thrown into the sea. So they are literally, it's kind of like a party, celebratory mood. And yet we get to verse 24, and it says, and the people complained against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? I can't imagine there being that much time has passed. You go from partying, celebrating, you're dancing, you're singing a song, to, hey, wait a second, wait. Who brought the igloo cooler? And everybody looks around and they realize this water, this natural water here, tastes bitter. Now, more than likely, what did the water have in it?
Salt.
Say that again?
Salt.
Two things, archaeologically speaking. Probably salt and sulfur. That region is obviously well known to have salt. You've got the Dead Sea in the region, the Red Sea. And the bitter, the smell, more than likely also had a sulfur component to it.
Brad,
Yes.
Can I just stop you there? With
Sure.
the site of the Red Sea crossing,
Yes.
I think you might have actually been touching on it with that fellow you were talking about earlier.
Yes.
Is there problems with the site of the Red Sea crossing? Do we still have any inkling of where it might have been? Because I've seen some where they actually claim that the site of the crossing is round about where Mount Sinai is now, and claiming that Mount Sinai is actually over on the other side of the Red Sea. It was one of those amateur sort of videos. Let's see, it'd probably be land that we call Midian now. Midian in the Old Testament, or I think it's Saudi Arabia now. So in other words, what I'm saying is some people claim that the Israelites trekked all the way down to the traditional location of Mount Sinai, crossed the Gulf of Aqaba, and then climbed up a new Mount Sinai on the far side. Just where the Gulf of Aqaba meets the main portion of the Red Sea, where there's a constriction there. That's what one of the claims was. Now, I don't know anything about it, but I was just interested.
If you do and I'm actually doing it real quick online just to kind of see and look. If you do a real quick Google search on the Red Sea crossing, what you're going to find are literally just a barrage of different views as to whether they crossed, for instance, whether they crossed one of the gulfs, or whether they crossed right through the middle, whether they crossed one of the ends. The fact of the matter is, we know for sure they crossed the Red Sea. Do we have any kind of footprints that tell us where they went in and chariot wheels at the bottom to show us exactly? No. There's a lot of things I think that God purposefully has hidden from us so that we won't end up worshiping that. I get asked the question a lot about the ark. Have we found Noah's ark? The answer is, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think so. And I think if you look back through Old Testament history, God has done a very effective job of making sure that we don't find certain altars, the Ark of the Covenant, some of these things like this that we would start doing pilgrimages to, or we would set up a tourist shop, or we would basically go there to worship these things rather than worship Him. Because think about it, Jared, in all seriousness, if we knew precisely where the crossing was, do you not think that would be a massive tourist trap right now?
Yeah, I'd want
There'd be a lot. Oh yeah, you'd go diving.
Yeah.
You'd have a lot of people who would go there trying to maybe touch the waters to heal themselves. You'd have people who would go there and set up resort condominiums. But God is smarter than that. Yes.
Brad, going back on what Jared was just saying here, I've heard the same thing about Mount Sinai, it not being actually where we see it to be in the map in the back of our Bible, but clear across on the other side. Is what do you know about that?
Well, we know from Psalm 104 that God had changed the topography of the earth after the flood. If you look very carefully, I think it's 104 starting at about verse 5, where it talks about you covered the earth as with a garment. You stretch the mountains up, you pull the valleys down to the place which you stored for them, that it should not be covered again. So we know part of the reason why the water was taken away, or part of the reason the water can be accounted for, is that God physically changed the topography of the earth. Now, there again, do we know for sure what He changed? No. Do we know? All we know is that He pulled mountains up, stretched valleys down to a place which He founded for them. So is it possible that some of these mountain ranges, Mount Ararat, Mount Sinai, that they were in one location and that they moved or they changed? Absolutely. But I'm not willing as a scientist and a Christian to just go out on a limb and say, okay, this is it. Because, guys, anytime you start speculating that much, you have opened the door for criticism in a big way. Because all skeptics got to do is find one little thing wrong with what you're saying, and from that point on, your credibility is shot with him, but more importantly, your credibility is shot with your home congregation. And so when it comes to things like this, here's how I personally would handle it. If I'm teaching in Mile High Church of Christ, and we're doing an intensive study on the crossing of the Red Sea, I would simply toss out and say, there's a lot of different views about where he crossed. In fact, there are scholars out there who have proposed that maybe Mount Sinai is not in the location that we find it in today, that it was actually moved. We have scriptural evidence of mountains being changed in Psalm 104. We don't know for sure. However, that is one possibility. That way you're not leaving the door open and you haven't basically walked out on a limb for somebody to cut off. Does that make sense?
Yes. The only reason why I asked it, Brad, is that I'd heard that there wasn't the traditional location of Mount Sinai does not have the sufficient space to sort of house the people in the manner that it talks of, where Moses is actually able to talk to them.
Right.
But I realise when we look at our traditional maps, that doesn't even show them going over the Red Sea properly anyway as a miraculous crossing. So
right.
We can't really put too much trust in them.
Well, and that's me is, you guys have lived long enough that you've seen cities' names change. You've seen different governments coming and going and nations rising and falling. So for us to put a whole lot of stock on a map that's in the back of our Bible that has labels on it is probably rather foolish given the time period, the fact that we've got still roughly, in round numbers, 3,500 years of history, Earth's history, is going to pass between what we're talking about today and us to present. So to kind of keep that in mind, roughly half of the history of the world has not transpired. So is it smart for us to say, okay, this is the way it was, and, the mountains, the rivers haven't changed since then? Guys, I think that is very naive. Look at verse 26. If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, keep all of his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. The very, very, very popular book called None of These Diseases, written by a man by the name of Dr. S.I. McMillan. If you have never read it, let me encourage you to get a copy of it. It will enhance your knowledge, especially if you're ever going to take Christian evidences in a place like Bear Valley. It would be a good resource to have. Why is this particular command of significance? What were the Egyptians at that time? Come on, guys. Think globally. Don't just kind of hem yourselves in. Think big picture here. Big picture is the Egyptians were the wealthy. They were the most civilized. They were the ones that had the massive structures. We even think in some cases they may have had indoor plumbing. So here you've got a group of people that have been able to successfully erect monuments and pyramids and hanging garden, all these things. And God is telling this ragtag group of slaves, you do what I tell you, you're not going to get sick. Who do you think had the best doctors back then?
The Egyptians.
Allegedly, the Egyptians. I mean, here you've got the Pharaoh, he's got his sorcerers, his doctors, his magicians, and yet God is telling this group of slaves, you do what I tell you, you're going to be okay. It would kind of be like if, if Jonathan came to me. He said, you know what, I'm having a heart attack. And I said, that's all right, we're going to put you on a plane. we'll fly you to the bushland of Africa, and we'll find you a good doctor. You guys would think I was crazy because, after all, supposedly, depending on what the next 6 months bring, we've got the best health care in the United States of America. That's subject to change. But in all reality, guys, God is telling these folks, you do what I tell you, you're not going to be sick. Now, this verse, if you put a star beside this verse, it is going to become very important as we start looking at some of the Levitical laws, some of the medical laws that he's giving them, cleanliness laws, things before we ever knew what a bacteria was. Here he is telling them, if you do what I tell you, you're not going to get sick, even though they didn't know about bacteria. He is prepping them, letting them know, look, you can believe me, don't worry about what the Egyptians said. We get to chapter 16, we get bread from heaven. So, manna. The way I want you to think about manna is it was a blessing from God with temporary value. It faded over time. It served a temporary need. And then I would put beside that, similar to money today. I'm going to repeat that just so you kind of get it. Manna is a blessing from God. It had temporary value, which faded over time. It served a temporary need, similar to money today. You pick up in verse 3 of that chapter, chapter 16. Again, we find them complaining, whining, groaning. Children of Israel said to them, oh, that we died in the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread and were full. You brought us out into the wilderness to kill the whole assembly at hunger. I mean, when you look at how much these people are complaining, if you were Moses, what would you be tempted to do? You know what that staff can also do? You guys think that you're ever going to be faced with complaining members in your congregation?
Nah.
Nah. Christians don't complain. And we don't argue. Ever. And if you believe that, I got some oceanfront property I'd sell you. Somebody try to explain to me what was manna. I mean, I gave you a definition, but how would you describe it to a non-Christian, somebody who you're opening up the scriptures to? What is this?
Bread.
Okay. Kaylee.
I don't know how reliable this source is, but I've seen notes that say it had similar taste to coriander, which is pretty much very tasteless. And
Okay.
so Jesus calls it the bread that came from heaven, so it probably just had a very plain consistency.
Okay, so like verse 31, specifically talking about coriander, the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like white coriander seed. The taste of it was like wafers made with honey. One of the things that I want you guys to pull from this particular chapter is the fact that God, again, I told you this book, Exodus, we start getting a feel for who God is. He sets some parameters around manna. Somebody tell me what they could and couldn't do with it.
They couldn't take more than what they needed for that day.
Okay? Every day you got to get up and get your daily allotment. And you're not supposed to do what?
Store any for the next day.
Store any. Don't, look at verse 19. Let no one leave any until morning. So God is starting to give them specific instructions. He wants them to be obedient. So again, we're starting to see more of who this God is, the fact that he expects and deserves obedience. He is giving commands that are ultimately for their good, because if they follow these commands, they're going to be fed. Obviously, you all know the rest of the story. They get tired of manna. They're like, look, we don't want to be vegetarians all our life. And so God has to send what? Well, thank you. Okay, chapter 17. We've got one of the very well-known accounts, water from rock. Look in verse 4. So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do with these people? What led him to that point? What took him from the point of basically saying, stand back and watch the power of the Lord, to, all right, God, what am I going to do with these people? If you back up and look, starting in verse 2 of chapter 17, therefore the people contended with Moses, said, give us water that we may drink. So Moses said to them, why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water. People complained against Moses and said, why is it that you brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? By this point, he's about fed up with them, and I don't blame him. Because, folks, you're talking about a group of people that has seen firsthand, witnessed the miracles of God. You know, at some point, they need to learn to sit down and think to themselves, okay, God's got us this far. He's going to get us the rest of the way. He's going to provide for us. We know in verse 6 that God instructs Moses, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb. You shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Again, you might put a small asterisk there, because in that instance, Moses is going to follow the instructions to a T, and yet, on the next occasion we find him, God tells him to do what to a rock?
Speak to the rock.
Speak to the rock. Moses says, you know what? I've been here, done this before. Takes his rod, strikes it. And because of that one small piece of disobedience, what happened? He misses out on the land of milk and honey. Now, guys, if you don't preach that to your congregations to teach them the importance of doing things God's way, I mean, you know for yourselves how much stuff is starting to come into the church. You know that there are people who are wanting women to lead singing. You know that there are people who are wanting to bring instruments back. You know that we have adopted so many denominational programs thinking that's going to increase our numbers. All of this stuff, when ultimately Moses got kept out of the land of milk and honey simply because he struck a rock and didn't speak to it. Now, if you don't think that's important in following instruction, doing things the way God instructed you to do it, you got another thing coming. What is the classic example we oftentimes give in obeying, doing things the way God instructed, or else there's high consequence to be paid?
Nadab and Abihu.
Okay, Nadab and Abihu. What about a certain ox cart?
Oh, yeah. I love that story.
Yeah.
How do you guys
What was
say
the man's name? Uzzah.
Uzzah and the buzzer? Yeah. Uzzah got the buzzer.
I was told by a preacher in the state of Texas. I had done a seminar in Texas. I had some time on Saturday, was driving around, saw a huge billboard that said, "Come rock with us on Saturday night." And then it gave a name and an address of a Church of Christ. I thought, what in the world? So I looked them up online. Sure enough, this was one of those groups that basically said, hey, are you tired of getting up on Sunday mornings? Well, you can rock out with us on Saturday night, yada, yada, yada. So I very kindly, just, somewhat innocently sent the preacher an email, said, hey, saw your sign, just curious as to what's going on. He responded back. He was very excited about their new programs. It was showing potential to reach out in the community, yada, yada, yada. And, I didn't want to get into a long, drawn-out thing, but I did send him an email back and said, what happened to doing things the way God instructed? We got a plan. The plan's worked for 2,000 years. Why do we need to change it? He wrote back to me, and his exact words were, I'm tired of being uzzed to death. We got a lot of people out there who do not want you to point out the fact that they are disobeying, that they are doing things contrary to God's will. But that doesn't change it, folks.
Isn't he acknowledging that he's not doing the right thing when he says that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely he is. I mean, when you got a preacher who knows book, chapter, and verse of an account, biblical account, where a man is struck dead for not following God's rule, to me that's him going, okay, I know about this, I'm just sick and tired of hearing it. So, look back at verse 15. Chapter 17, verse 15. Moses built an altar, called its name, The Lord is my banner. So again, throughout this whole procedure, we see him setting up a memorial, multi-generational faithfulness. And speaking of multi-generational, now we get Jethro coming into the picture. Moses' father-in-law. Chapter 18 deals with him. The main thing that most of you recall from that particular chapter is the fact that Jethro goes to Moses and says what? What was Moses spending all his time doing at this point?
Judging the people. Judging the people.
Judging the people. He was putting out fires. He had gone from being a leader to a full-time judge and fireman. And again, this is healthy advice for a man who's going to preach the gospel. I don't know how many of you all have already been preachers or have spent time doing this, but for those who have had an occasion to preach, I think if you're honest with me and honest with yourselves, you recognize it can get easy to get bogged down in the red tape of a church organization versus preaching and teaching the gospel. And that's kind of what was going on here with Moses. He was the sole judge, and as such, there's this long line of people every single day that are coming in front of him, and he's basically having to say, okay, in this case this, in this case this, in this case this. I don't know how many of you have done overseas mission work, but what I picture in my mind, we did a medical mission down in Nicaragua, and we physically had set up in an open schoolhouse there, we were way out in the bushland, and our tents were in one room. We spent the night in this one open area. Every morning, starting by at least, say, about 3:30 or 4 a.m., the people would start lining up. And by 5, there was a line so long that we physically couldn't see it. It was already down the road of people who were getting in line, wanting to be seen, and wanting, the free material, the free drugs, and the free whatever. But already that early in the morning, guys, they had lined up. They were wanting this thing. That's kind of what I picture mentally in this scene. Here you got Moses. He wakes up, and he knows all day long is going to be spent serving this long line right here. Jethro sees it, and look in verse 14. Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people. He said, what is this thing that you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit and all the people stand before you from morning until evening? Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have difficulty, they come to me. I judge between one and another. I make known the statutes of God and his laws. Notice verse 17, guys. Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. Moses couldn't do it all. And he needed somebody to remind him of that. He needed somebody with wisdom to look him in the eye and say, hey, you're a great man, a great leader, you've done a great thing, but you need help. And there again, that's great wisdom, great advice for us today. As we look out and sometimes we feel like Elijah, basically looking around thinking, man, I'm the only one out here doing anything. And yet there are other people out there. We just need to realize that, yes, there are people willing to help prop up our hands, so to speak. Look down at verse 25. Actually, I'll back up in 24. So Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law. He did all that he said. Moses chose able men out of all of Israel, made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10. The point that I want to make there is this. There had to be a massive number of people there, folks. If he's got rulers over thousands, rulers over hundreds, rulers over 50s, rulers over 10s, that's a lot of judges to help him out. And I think it's also important the fact that he broke it down into smaller and smaller and smaller segments so that the people could have their voices heard. Now, if you look, the hard cases still went up to Moses. The next two verses. So they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small case themselves. Yes, sir. David.
I said, doesn't this look kind of like the starting of the military organization, too, for when they're going to be conquering? Because now they have commanders over X number of people.
Yes. Well, it's also, if you think about it, what was the judicial system in place when they finally took over the land of milk and honey? God gave to them what?
Judges.
Judges. Judges. Not kings, judges. Now, eventually they asked for kings. But this was a judicial type system. Questions, comments up to chapter 19. All right. Verse 19, chapter 19, verse 1, we've got a time element. Kind of giving us an idea, okay, how long has all this been transpiring? You know, don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't, try to zoom out every once in a while and ask yourself, okay, where are we? We know that we've left Joseph. Joseph died. There arose a ruler that didn't know Joseph. Moses is born. He's put into a basket. Pharaoh's daughter finds him. You guys remember the sequence of events from him being reared up. He slays an Egyptian. He goes into hiding. God calls him at the burning bush. He says, hey, wait, you got the wrong man. What you really want is somebody who can speak like my brother Aaron. Moses says, okay, look, I've got the plan. You're going to enact it. They go, they deliver the people out. We've got the series of plagues. Finally, they are fully delivered. They cross the Red Sea. God is showing his power all along the way. Okay, look, you think the Egyptians are coming after you? I'll part the sea. You hungry? I'll give you manna. You thirsty? Strike the rock. And now it says, in the third month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. So all this stuff that we've just read about, crossing the Red Sea, the complaining, the griping, Jethro coming to Moses, all of that has happened in what span of time?
3 months.
3 months. Not a whole lot of time, guys. In the grand scheme of things, that's basically a football season. Now look at verse 4. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. And this is the Lord saying to him. In fact, I'm going to back up and start in verse 3. Moses went up to God. The Lord God called to him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, tell the children of Israel, that you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you upon eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you'll indeed obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all the people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So Moses came, he called for the elders of the people, laid before them all of these words which the Lord commanded of him. Notice verse 8. Then all of the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. If only that attitude would have prevailed, then the history of mankind would be different from where we find it today. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And yet, time and time again, God tells them, okay, you go into the land, you kill everybody. You don't collect anything for yourselves, and yet they didn't do that. Time and time again, God says, don't follow their customs, and yet they did it. God says, don't you worship Baal, and yet they did it. At this point, basically in your notes, what you might make a mental change or a big highlighted change. We're going from the deliverance phase to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is going to carry us quite a ways here, several chapters. Obviously, we know one of the major things that happens at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up and he gets the Ten Commandments. Somebody tell me the significance of chapter 19 at the end, where God is trying to communicate the fact that the people do not need to come up the mountain. In fact, if you look, verse 12, you shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves, that you do not go up to the mountain, touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. What's going on right there?
God is there. He's kind of showing the holy.
He is trying to communicate the fact that he is holy. That remember what he told Moses at the burning bush? Take off your shoes. This is holy ground. Not just anybody gets to walk up and talk to God. Moses, you've been selected. Tell the people to wait down there and listen to my commands from you. So Moses went down, verse 14, from the mountain to the people. Sanctified the people. Washed their clothes. You're talking about some people who were not physically, mentally, or spiritually ready to be in the presence of God. They needed to be sanctified. They needed to be washed. Because quite frankly, they were just a ragtag group of slaves that had a tendency to complain and whine. Chapter 20. We start getting into the meat. Yeah.
I've got one question before we continue on. There in verse
Absolutely.
15, it says, and he said to the people, be ready for the third day, do not come near your wives. What was the reasoning for that?
Okay, back up to verse 14. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people, sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. He said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not come near your wives. Then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings, lightnings, a thick cloud of the mountain. The sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Why do you think he did not want them to go into their wives? There's an obvious answer, guys.
He wanted their minds to be on spiritual things.
Wanted their minds to be on spiritual things and for them to be clean. He wanted them to be in a right frame to be ready for this. You know what? I'm not trying to be tacky or to get into an area that we don't necessarily need to get to, but you can think of it this way. If you were an Olympian, the night before a big meet, one of the things that you probably would not be doing is having relations with your wife that night. And the reason being, you want to get a good night's rest. You want to be fully rested and fully energized, ready to go the next day. God is saying, I want these people focused on me and not let their mind wander or get distracted. Good question. Anything else? 10 Commandments, chapter 20. If you don't know them, you probably need to, guys. What do you say to somebody who says something about the 10 Commandments today? Like, for instance, let's do a little role play. I am a denominational person. Let me pick somebody here. Michael Smith, where you at?
Here. He's sick.
Oh, always. Jordan,
That's me.
raise your hand. There you go. Jordan, I am from the Presbyterian denomination, and I'm having a conversation with you at the post office, and I don't see any problem with them posting the 10 Commandments in my child's school. Because, after all, you think about it, the 10 Commandments, everybody should follow the 10 Commandments. What do you tell me?
Well, we're not under the Ten Commandments, according to the New Testament. All of them are reiterated. Those are still, except for the Sabbath, all, moral things. We still need to live that way, but we're not under that law anymore.
So you don't follow the 10 Commandments?
I follow the principles of the Ten Commandments, but I don't follow them because they're there. I follow them because they're in the New Testament.
Okay. You're going to run into a lot of people out there, guys, who think we are still under the 10 Commandments. A lot of places they're still trying to get the 10 Commandments in the classroom. They're trying to put it back into courtrooms, things like that. And understand, I don't have a problem with people posting 10 Commandments all day long. I really, really, truly don't. Because, to me, it's another part of God's Word, and you want to put up any of God's Word anywhere publicly, I'm cool with that. But I do think we need to educate ourselves to understand that this is the old law, and that thankfully we have a new and a better covenant today. Because it's not just 10 Commandments. As we're about to see, there are all kinds of laws these folks had to hold to. And for somebody just to say, well, it was just 10 Commandments, no. They had rules and regulations about everything. What else would you guys add to that?
Brad,
Yeah.
I might add that because they're part of the Old Covenant, when Jesus died on the cross, that Old Covenant was nailed to the cross and was done away with. And being the 10 Commandments are part of the Old Covenant, we are not bound by them being under the New Covenant.
Okay? How would you prove to me that it's nailed to the law? What Bible verses specifically would you use to teach me that we're not under it anymore?
Use your memory verse. Colossians 2:14, 16, Ephesians 2:15, is Galatians chapter 3, 16 through 19, Romans 7, 1 through 7. They all say the same thing, pretty much.
Okay. Which is?
That another point to it is important that the Ten Commandments were given to the Jews only, and they weren't given to any Gentile. So,
Very good. We are right now, we're starting what age? What period? The Mosaic age. So we are starting the transition between the patriarchal age and the Mosaic age. I've got in my Bible, this is my favorite Bible. I can't give it up. It's got all my notes and stuff in it. I've got in the inside, outside covers notes. You guys probably can't see them. Of certain topics, certain things like key passages for instrumental music, for instance, or what about evil, pain, and suffering, or what about one of the things that I've got notes on are scriptures that designate the fact that we have nailed the old law, that Jesus put it on the cross. Because there are going to be times where you guys are going to need to point that out to folks. And I think if you can get across the fact that, yes, it was nailed to the cross with him, then that's going to help them to start slowly comprehending where we are today, what age we're under today. Because in the Methodist Church, I thought Sunday was a Sabbath. Yes.
Don't you think that that's not really an appropriate place to start a discussion on that, but to more or less agree with her in a way that you would like to look at that together? Can we look at that or meet with someone, instead of discussing that at the post office, somehow, make it more appealing to where you can take it further and agree, because the 10 Commandments are great. That, in fact, if people did live by them, we'd have a much better place that we live today. But most people ignore them, but just to somehow keep that from getting into a debate, so to speak, right there in the post office, because then you're kind of you're messing up the witness for God in general out in the public like that.
I agree and I disagree. I agree that it's always wise to approach things somewhat cautiously and try to set up that next study and to not necessarily have a big public display, especially if emotions are heated up or whatever. I think if it were me personally, what I would do is I would say, I agree. I wish that more people would follow the 10 Commandments, think about where our society would be today, because on that phrase, I've just joined me and that person together.
That's right.
And then I look at him and I say, but aren't you thankful that we're under the New Testament?
That's a good way.
And I would probably even go on and add another sentence or two, just saying something to the effect of, have you ever studied all the stuff they had to do in the Old Testament? And aren't you thankful that we are under this New Testament? If you got some time, I'd love to show you the differences between the Old and the New Testament.
That's good.
JT.
I would probably
Jackie.
ask that person, is there a difference between moral laws and ceremonial laws under the law of Moses? And maybe ask them, do they offer animal sacrifices today? And then why do they not do that?
So you would feel comfortable enough, literally kind of already going there, so to speak.
Well, I would just try to get them to understand that there is some laws under the law of Moses that are ceremonial laws, and they're not part of God's moral laws. The moral laws, of course, they're still for us today.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. And the thing that he mentioned about sacrifices, guys, keep that in your back hip pocket, because you will run into some folks who are going to try to convince you that we are still under the 10 Commandments. Give me a religious body that believes that.
Seventh-day Adventists.
Okay.
Church God.
I don't know how many of you have had conversations with them. I have, believe it or not, I have several that will come to my seminar on the weekends. And while they love the material about creation evolution, they love the morality stuff, they still want to try to convince you that you are wrong about the whole New Testament, the Sabbath, etc. And so, on several different occasions, I've been given tracts or booklets or pamphlets or papers trying to show me that we are still under the 10 Commandments. Jackie's point is well taken in that if you think we're under the old law and the 10 Commandments, why don't I see you taking a goat or a sheep up to your priest and letting him slit its throat?
Fred.
I've never seen, realistically, even the Seventh-day Adventists, their church buildings are structured in a more of a worship format than any kind of I don't think anybody in that room can truly understand the sacrificial setup of the temple, the tabernacle. This was not a house, quote unquote, of worship as much as it was a purifying ground and a slaughterhouse. I mean, there was blood and dead animals all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we don't see that today. Let's see. I'm trying to get you guys down right. Jordan, you had a question?
Yeah, the Seventh-day Adventists will make a distinction. They'll say the Ten Commandments, that was the law of God. All that other stuff, that was the law of Moses. And we're still under the law of God. And all those verses in the New Testament about Christ nailing it to the cross, he's nailing the law of Moses to the cross. But the Ten Commandments, those are the law of God. We're still under those.
Okay. How would you guys respond to that?
They're the same thing. Actually, Luke chapter 2, I think it's in 44, it shows that it's used interchangeably, the law of God and the law of Moses.
Okay, that's a great point.
And Joseph had an offer, a sacrifice.
What was that reference?
I think it's Luke chapter 2, somewhere around 44. Also in Nehemiah.
Ultimately, guys,
I'm sorry.
and I forget who said this, but ultimately, it may have been Jordan. Ultimately, we can agree with our neighbors that the Ten Commandments, the principles in the Ten Commandments, are good. And all of them are repeated in the New Testament, save the Sabbath. So do we, if I were to ask you on, I'm not going to ask you this on a test, so don't sweat it, but if I were to ask you on a test, do we observe 9 of the 10 Commandments? How would you go about answering that?
No.
Okay? And I would say incomplete answer. Give me some, why? Why no? David?
I would say that the ultimate ideas behind them we do follow. We don't murder, we don't lie, we don't covet and steal, because those are laid out in the New Testament. But we don't follow them because they're in the Ten Commandments. We follow them because God directed us to do that in the New Testament. So it'd be a yes and no answer.
Okay.
We can't.
We can't what?
Can't follow them. I mean, we can try and strive to do our best, but when Jesus said same thing about you've murdered if you hate your brother, or if you know what I'm saying? And there's times in road rage where I know I have murdered.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Remind me to park on the other side of the building when I come for my visit.
No, this was in the past. There's a whole lot more to that. But what I'm saying is, when I look at it that way, they're hard to. It's just too hard. It's burdensome, to go by.
Okay. Guys, it goes back to that idea of a will, last will, and testament. If somebody has written 2 wills, let's say your rich uncle, and in the first will he left you nothing, and in the second will he left you $50 million. And everybody comes to you and says, well, that new will is nice, but we'd rather go by the old will. What are you going to say? No. I want my money. I want the better plan. Yes, sir.
I was trying to point this out earlier when I whispered it to Anthony. Our memory verse was Hebrews chapter 9, and verse 15 throughout. Breaks it all down from Moses and to Christ to how we were under the old law, but once that testator is dead, the new one comes into effect. And once Christ came into effect, after he passed away, his new law comes into effect.
Yes. Hey, guys, here's the bottom line. Ultimately, we've got to communicate to people, and this goes back to what we were talking about, the whole scheme of redemption. The Bible's teaching the scheme of redemption. The blood of bulls and goats was not enough. It was not good enough. And so ultimately, if folks do not get the whole concept that, hey, this was a good system, it worked for a special group, a certain group of people for a while, but it was not a terminal solution. It was a temporary measure. It was kind of a stopgap to get them until we could get to that terminal solution. If people don't get that, then they're missing the crux of the Bible and the importance of Christ. The first 4 commandments are all what?
They're all related to God, man to God.
They are vertical. up and down, meaning our relationship with God. Okay? I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Number one, you shall have no other gods before me. Right off the bat, he is letting us know his position. Number two, don't make anything that looks like me or like another god. Don't have this carved image. Any likeness of anything that is in heaven or that is in the earth beneath or that is in water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So here we find another characteristic of God. God is holy, he is righteous. The Bible here is telling us he's jealous. He doesn't want you to have any other gods. Number three, don't mess with my name. You should not take the name of the Lord God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Number four, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Basically saying, look, don't mess with my day. That's my day. Now, I'm one of those weirdos who actually thinks that we still need to actually set aside some time on the first day of the week to give homage to God, to think about him, to basically meditate. I don't necessarily say no work on Sunday, but I do think that needs to be a day of reflection, a day where we kind of regroup and refocus. It's the first day of the week, and we want to start that week off right. We give of our firstlings back to God. If we treat it like just another day, oh yeah, well, I got to go for an hour to Bible class and worship, to me, we haven't really done our justice. Comments, questions up through verse 10. Put a big, fat, humongous asterisk by verse 11. That is a great verse for theistic evolutionists or for people who buy into evolution. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, rested the seventh day, wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and hallowed it. In one verse, you just learned he created the heavens, the earth, and the sea, and all that in them is. That leaves out nothing, literally. And that's where we'll pick up in a few minutes.